Hello, my name is Rob Garner. I'm a computer programming instructor, and today I'm going to discuss XML documentation for .NET applications. So why do we need documentation? Well, you want people in the future to understand your code, and it turns out that sometimes you may be that person, and it's not unusual for us to forget what we did about a week ago. And you don't want you tomorrow to be angry at you today, much less the rest of your team. So having code that's easy to understand and easy to maintain is the primary reason for having decent documentation. There's a couple different approaches that have been used for documentation. I'll roughly break them down into, a traditional approach, which is very comprehensive commenting throughout the application. One of the challenges of being very dogmatic about your documentation approaches is that it can go stale very early. So as people make changes, they often don't update the documentation, and unless you have very good controls on your organization, that may not always be the best approach. In other instances, that may actually be the best approach. So you have to fit your approach to documentation to the organization you're in. A more recent approach is the agile perspective, which is code should be more or less documenting as much as possible, but you use the appropriate amount of documentation and comments in order to make sure that what you have is clear. So sometimes they will refer to code comments as a code smell. Why couldn't you write it more clearly so you didn't need to use documentation? And I think that, in practice, we probably we need to use a balance of these approaches. You do need, invariably, your company is going to need to have certain comments placed in there, especially with regard to documenting, the intellectual property ownership of each piece of code. And putting in, in case someone gets access to that piece of code, declaring their rights to control that. And then also, usually some standards are usually applied about what they want that may be a little bit more dogmatic. But, at the end of the day, the key is your code should be clear and easy for someone to maintain. The best practices include, using summaries effectively. Briefly describe the purpose of classes and methods. So you don't necessarily need to use commenting, I think, to document what a class or function does so much, but maybe more why it's there and what purpose it serves, so that you know where it fits into the overall architecture of your application. And then sometimes you do have complex sections, which, just reading the code, if you read it and you can't make it any clearer than it is, you need to put comments in there to make it clear what that piece does. The other aspect of documentation isn't always just the words you put in it, but how you format things, where you put white space, how you separate out, your functions from your classes, and how you group your functions inside of a class to make it clear where things are. And consistency. If you do all these things consistently, you find that you can very quickly navigate through the application and find things. If you are kind of inconsistent and it's kind of messy, it becomes challenging to maintain. The worst part of this is that usually the hours spent finding things is an invisible cost. A well-maintained system, maybe a programmer spends only 2 or 3 minutes to get to where they need to start writing code. A more complex one, people may be spending 15, 20 minutes trying to decipher where things are located. So those minutes add up. So in one of the convenient features that we have in .NET is XML documentation. Most languages have some form of .comment capability. For .NET programs, it's XML. It's an XML format. It's supported by Visual Studio, and it kind of gives you a standardized documentation format which can be kind of dogmatic sometimes, but there's good reasons for it too. Properties build XML documentation file, we enable that. So I'll go to this one, go look at its properties. So we check this off, and we can provide a location where we want to place it. We can leave it blank for the default location. I'm going to leave it blank for the default location. So there are some common tags that we can create. Summary tags, parameter tags, return, examples. These are used to document functions primarily. So we have this badge, and what I can, as soon as you type 3 slashes, it kind of guesses what type of comments you need based on the structure of what you're doing it in front of. So I could just put in something here, represents a hackerspace badge that a person can earn. And you can now, the way you can think of what you put in here is, think of this as writing instructions to the person who's using this, who may not be you, to explain what this field is for. So, and so you can use these to kind of fill in what's going on. Now, this is seems pretty verbose, and maybe this is more than is needed in a lot of cases. Realize you can minimize these to get them out of the way. Not sure why this one minimizes in here, but may have to do with some spacing issues. Nope. Okay. But where this becomes really handy is when you use it. So let's say I was going to add a badges page. And I started to use it here. if I hover here, my text that I put in here shows up here. So this is why when you're writing those comments, that summary shows up here, and the person who's using your class, you can give them instructions here to make it easier for them to figure out how to use this. So I create a new badge here, and let's say I wanted to, okay, well, what's the ID? They want to look up, they're looking through your properties. This helps them understand what this is. What are turn-in instructions? Okay, admittedly a little bit long, but you can, you can give them enough so they know what this is, and that's really what the purpose of those summary comments are to do that. You can also use, so let's say we had a function bool add badge. I'll just do that for now. And we're adding documentation comments for this. Notice that here, because we have a return and we have a parameter, it stubs this out for you. You can change these. But it's making its best guess. Now, if we build this, so the next question is, where do these end up? If you click on Show All Files after your build, find the bin file. If you're building in debug, if you're building in release, you would look at under the, you'll see a release side rather than debug. And in the files that get built here, you'll find under the name of your assembly, which in this case is hackerspace, there's an XML file. If you open that XML file, what you'll find is there's all of our doc comments, all placed in a nice XML format. And you can see they have the name, which is auto-generated, and then a summary. Then all the attributes for that element are placed here: the summary, the param, the returns. And these were auto-generated by the migrations builder. But if you consistently go through and put those comments in, you have the ability to auto-generate. Now, this is important if you're a company that might sell its code. Often, if your code goes to another company, one of the contractual requirements is that there be documentation on it. This sure makes it a lot easier to build that documentation afterwards. So that's what we just did. We build the file. Now, and we saw the XML file is in there. Now, you can use that XML file directly as is, and you could write your own web page or piece of code to turn that into a Word document or anything else like that. But there are some tools that are already out there, notably Sandcastle and DocFX, to create formatted documentation. And And once you use those, you can actually just open up that documentation in a browser or editor and just use it. And they provide the ability to make a documentation file automatically. Now, you would probably use that documentation file if you're publishing definitely some sort of a library file that for others to use. Maybe less important for just a user application. But you do want to be able to produce that quickly if that's a requirement for selling a company, for example. So overall, what are the benefits of documentation? Even if you don't produce the documentation pages, we saw how the comments showed up when someone was hovering over your class as it's being used. So even if you don't create documentation pages, XML comments are very useful to make it easier to use the classes you create. It improves maintenance by using just good documentation practices, using clear class names and variable names, and a good structure makes it easier to decipher code. And then when you do need to generate documentation, this provides a quick way to create a professionally looking API documentation. The other thing to discuss is document intellectual property. Why do we want to document intellectual property? Well, first of all, legal protection. You want to avoid copyright infringement, so you want to make sure that whatever you use in your application follows the licensing requirements for that asset. This can include images, video, snippets of code. So you want to give credit where credit is due, and it also allows you to track. You want to make it easy to track the intellectual property that you're using through your application. So these are examples of things that you want to document in your code. Code, images, sound, video, and to track it. First off, you need to go to the source of that documentation and try to find the author, the source, and the licensing type. Not all assets out there will necessarily identify the licensing, so then you might not want to use a asset without clear licensing identified. Ideally, you want an open source license, but if not, if you pay for licensing use of something, you want to make sure that those rights are documented in your code. And generally, the provider of an asset will provide what they want for attribution, and so you need to follow their guidelines. So it can be different in each case, so you need to read for each intellectual property piece that you use. And so somewhere in your code, you need to mention the license types and the full licensing. Good place to put that is, maybe make a file that says credits or third-party libraries. The other place you can place it is in a README file. So if you're putting your code on GitHub, generally there's a README file at the very beginning. That's a great place to put any licensing that you're using. And then keep track of the specific versions you use, not just the source, but also the version of it that you use. And when you're doing that, make it easy to read and clear. You use a visible location, the README in the library, file, on GitHub. Put it in the README section. If it's on a website, you might want to have a credits page, or in the about page, put something in there, or at the bottom of the web page where that is being used, you could put a little footer that identifies the attribution. And that might be one of the things you put into your checklists when you deploy, is checking the attribution of any assets to make sure that they're complete. So README or credit section, and here's some examples of what it might look like. Some examples: license under free use license, Creative Commons. So you're going to get this phrasing from the resource that you use. So, and finally, documentation, combine traditional agile approaches. The key here is to make sure that you can read your code one time and understand exactly what it's doing, and help your people maintaining your code to find where they need to update things very, very quickly. And good documentation is vital for good teamwork. It ends up being an invisible cost if you don't see it. It's often called tech debt, where if your code's obscure, it can take up to half an hour to find where you need to update something. Well-documented code can take just a matter of minutes to find it, and those minutes add up in maintaining a website. So thank you very much, and that is my introduction to using XML commenting and documentation in general. Thank you.